Christabel, you want to introduce yourself?
Yes, hello everyone. I'm Christabel Robinson. I'm the program coordinator for the Global Center on Human Trafficking. Thank you all for your patience, by the way. We were having tech issues because, you just can't go without tech issues in a Zoom built world. So thank you for being patient while we figure that out.
Great. So let's just jump right in. We will leave some time at the end for questions. If you have questions along the way, feel free to put them into the chat and we'll address them as we can throughout the presentation, but we will definitely leave some time at the end. So just a little bit about myself. I've been working on the issue of human trafficking for over 25 years. I first encountered the issue of human trafficking when I was a Peace Corps volunteer in the Baltic states and realized that students were being trafficked right out from under our noses out in our school. And from there went on to start a nonprofit organization that I was the executive director of for 18 years and worked in more than 23 countries on the issue of human trafficking. This topic of the intersection of human trafficking and libraries is actually really near and dear to my heart because I grew up across the street from my public library. So I'm an avid reader and I spent a lot of time in my public library taking out books and have a real love for libraries because of that. So really happy to be doing this work. Just a little bit about the Global Center on Human Trafficking. We are a center, a 501c3 center under our foundation, located within on the campus of Montclair State University. I don't know how much you all know about Montclair State University, but we are the largest public university in the state of New Jersey, and we are—
Is there something else I can help with?
Oh, sorry, that was my watch. That was my Siri watch. What's very unique about Montclair and what I think makes us the perfect university to be addressing human trafficking is we're a Hispanic serving institution. We've also recently acquired and in partnership with Bloomfield, which is one of the only historically Black colleges in the state of New Jersey. They were having financial difficulties, and our president worked with the New Jersey legislature for them to become part of Montclair, but yet still retain their unique characteristics. And what we do know from research is that Black and Hispanic populations are at increased risk of human trafficking. We also have a commitment as a university to working in partnership with other community members and other organizations to transform the lives of people in those communities. So this work fits very nicely with the mission of Montclair State University. So we are really unique in that we are committed to trying to develop survivor-inclusive policies, research, and practices. And while that may seem like a very straightforward thing, right, to engage the community that you're trying to impact, that unfortunately does not always happen. So that is something we are striving to do as part of our mission here at Montclair. Next slide, please. Our work is organized in 4 pillars. So we have a survivor empowerment initiative that actually Christabel heads up. We also are doing a lot of work in policy and practice to change the policies and practices that work to prevent and address human trafficking. We have a pillar that's focused on research and knowledge. There is a very big dearth of information and research on the issue of human trafficking. And sadly, a lot of what goes on is just based on what people want to do or what they think will help. And so we're really leading a push to have everything be evidence-based. So we have evaluation components and we really build in data collection to the projects that we are leading out of Montclair. And then 4th, our last pillar is the Next Generation Initiative. So because we are a research institution and we have over 20,000 students, we have a very active internship and volunteer program, and we engage students both at the undergraduate and graduate level in our work so that they can get the training no matter what industry they go into, whether it's business, nursing, public health, but that they can bring this knowledge of human trafficking into their careers. a little bit about how we do our work. We work from a human rights-based approach. We're very committed, as I mentioned, to engaging survivors in our work. This work is extremely multidisciplinary. As you'll learn when we go throughout this presentation, human trafficking intersects with almost every field. If you name any department that we have at Montclair, I can make a connection to human trafficking. I mean, a lot of people are even like, what is the connection between human trafficking and libraries? And we're going to talk about that later on in the presentation. I think I covered all the rest of this. So a little bit about what we do. We are active at the global level. We have a couple of international projects. We actually have 3 international projects. We have worked in partnership with the UN. We have a very big event coming up. If after you want to learn more about this, we have a legislative breakfast. This is going to be our second breakfast coming up on February 2nd, I believe it is. And we will have the New Jersey Attorney General along with some leading advocates, survivors, and policymakers, and we're going to be focusing on housing and the connection of housing to human trafficking this year. We also do a lot of training. We hold workshops, we provide training, we have an on-campus program for girls at this point on human trafficking. We do research, we publish, and we also, if you don't know, we'll put the link in the chat. We have created the first comprehensive statewide directory on human trafficking for New Jersey. So we compiled all different kinds of resources for addressing the issue of human trafficking, and we'll share that with you. We're also creating a comprehensive campus response to human trafficking toolkit that we plan to share with universities really across the country and maybe even globally. Okay, so at the end of this training, we hope that you will have a better understanding of what is human trafficking. In the United States, there's a human trafficking law that is bifurcated into labor and sex trafficking, and we're going to discuss both types of trafficking. We hope that you will gain an understanding of kind of why human trafficking is occurring, the who, what, where, when, why, and how of human trafficking. So we call this like our HT 101 to get a basic understanding. And we plan to give you information on what makes people vulnerable to human trafficking and kind of what are the indicators, what you should keep your eye out for that might be indicative that people are either being groomed for trafficking or are engaged in human trafficking. We'll talk a little bit about what are some of the best practices of engaging with survivors of human trafficking, and really important, how to report a potential case, right? Because we want the library to be safe. We want the staff to be safe. We want the
I found this on the web.
All right, I'm going to take my watch off. It keeps talking to me. We want the patrons to be safe. So we are going to give you a little bit of guidance on, what to do. Is this slide 8, Christabel? I can't see numbers.
Yes.
Okay, so with this, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Christabel Robinson, to introduce herself and to kick off our training.
Thanks so much, Allie. So as I said before, I'm the program coordinator here at the Global Center on Human Trafficking. I'm also a lived experience professional. And for those in the room who might not know what that means that I am a trafficking survivor who works in the anti-trafficking space in a professional context. And so I am a survivor. I'm here full-time, professional in the space, developing and doing these trainings. But my lived experience does affect how I come to the space, the information I'm giving you today, and just adds a slightly more intricate layer into our trainings because I'm able to provide that one-on-one perspective. We are going to be talking about some heavy materials today. So if for a minute you need to take a step back and breathe, or if you need a second to process anything, please feel free to do so. We always want you to put your mental health first. But if you have any questions, drop them in the chat and we'll get to them.
Christabel, could you also give a shout out to our New Jersey Link partners, because I neglected to do that because I was so frazzled.
And John, I don't know if you actually got to introduce yourself either, but maybe this would be a great time because yes, thank you to Library Link New Jersey for hosting this event with us and making sure that you had access to attending today. So John, come on up, talk. Okay, so sorry about that.
No worries. Hi, I'm John Braun. I'm the online learning and digital content specialist here at Library Link NJ, and I'm just happy to be here helping facilitate the chat during the presentation. Thanks for having me.
Thank you, John. And John's our library translator. So if there are questions to be translated language-wise, he'll make sure that both parties understand each other and the questions. So we're going to start off this conversation by talking about what is human trafficking. According to the National Human Trafficking Hotline, which is run by Polaris here in the US, human trafficking is defined as a crime against people's very humanity, right? This crime occurs when a trafficker uses force, fraud, or coercion to control another person for the purpose of engaging in commercial sex acts or soliciting labor or services against their will. Force, fraud, or coercion do not need to be present in an individual engaging in commercial sex acts under the age of 18, but we're going to get into that a little bit more later. The TVPA came out in 2000. It was developed as a response to human trafficking cases cropping up here in the US. For those who don't know, that was actually based off of a case that originally started as a disabilities rights case, because that first largely recognized case was actually labor traffickers trafficking people with disabilities and using them to peddle, to beg, and that sort of thing. So the Trafficking Victims Protection Act was meant to give people a way to define human trafficking so that they could prosecute these cases. So the process that they came up with was the process, the means, and the end. So the process usually looks like inducing, recruiting, harboring, transporting, providing, or obtaining. I want to quickly highlight, though, that while this says transport, that we're not talking about transporting over borders. We hear that myth a lot, where human smuggling and human trafficking are the same thing. They are not. Human smuggling is transportation-based. Human trafficking is exploitation-based. And while they can overlap, they more often than not don't here in the US. And so I just want to clear that up. When we say transport, we're just talking about maybe a trafficker is transporting their victim between the house and the place that they're trafficking them. Maybe it's a hotel, maybe it's their workplace, who knows, but maybe they're providing that transport to school, and then that is the vulnerability that they're using to weaponize against the victim to traffic them. The means that they use to do that are force, fraud, and coercion. Transparently, here in the US, we probably see force the least. Traffickers don't want to be noticed, and because they don't want to be noticed, they're more than likely going to go through fraud or coercion before they go through means of force. What that means is when you're seeing all these videos online that are saying that people are having zip ties tied to their cars so that people can be dragged into white vans and skirted off to be trafficked, that is not the usual way of trafficking. That doesn't mean that people aren't being targeted, but it's not for trafficking purposes. Actually, as someone who comes from the streets, I can tell you more often than not, those ties to the cars are actually just to make you question things long enough and distract you long enough that they can commit robbery, or that they can jack your car, something like that. But they're not looking to just grab people off the street and traffic them. That's not common here in the US. And then the end is obviously the commercial sex acts or the labor, services, or debt bondage. Sorry for that noise, everyone. And again, as I said earlier, this does not apply for commercial sex acts for minors under 18 years of age. If you are under 18 years of age and someone is engaging, using force, fraud, or coercion, or in any way for a commercial sex act, that's automatically considered human trafficking. It gets a little hazier with labor trafficking laws here in the US, and we're going to delve maybe a bit more into that later. But as far as commercial sex acts go, under 18 automatically considered trafficking. That doesn't necessarily mean that every state and every jurisdiction does a great job of that. We still see a lot of minors arrested every year and charged with crimes, intent to solicit, theft, and trafficking drugs, any number of things. So we do see minors being arrested quite a bit still, but it's getting better. Human trafficking generates more than $150 billion a year in profits for traffickers. It is in one of the top 3 criminal industries globally, and it's only exceeded by arms and drugs. And I'm going to delve into labor trafficking first. Definition of labor trafficking by the TVPA is the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, or obtaining of a person for labor service or services through the use of force, fraud, or coercion for the purpose of subjection to involuntary servitude, peonage, debt bondage, or slavery. And there are other forms of trafficking as well, but those are the more common ones that we see here in the US. Commonly speaking, right here on the right side, you'll see the ones that we most commonly see reported via the human trafficking hotline here in the US. That's domestic work, that's agriculture, that's traveling sales crews. Think about people selling candy bars door to door, or who are selling flowers on the corner of the street or holding up homeless signs. We see those cases a lot. Restaurants and food hospitality industry in general, health and beauty, think salons, massage parlors, hair salons, nail salons, that sort of thing. And then industrial work. I was actually reading an article about a trafficking case that was happening. I want to say it was in the Southwest, where they had a manufacturer who was employing minors to package meat for them. So industrial work can be a wide variety of things. It could be car parts, could be any business whatsoever. It just matters about the employer's practices. This is actually a common case. This is a really large case that came up here in New Jersey a couple of years ago now. It was more than a couple of years, I guess now, time is flying, but over 200 workers were identified at a New Jersey Hindu temple. I believe it's out of Robbinsville, and I actually might be able to get that link for you guys so that you can read more about it. But over 200 workers were identified as being trafficked for $1 an hour. They were recruited from India. The victims thought that when they were coming here on their religious visas, that they were going to be making a good income and they were going to be sending that money back to their families. And what actually happened was that they were forced to work for about $1 an hour. They were being watched on cameras. They weren't allowed to speak out to other people. And they were told, if you try to leave, we're going to have the police pick you up and deport you. So it was a really big case that happened. I encourage you to read that link below. It was a really interesting case here in New Jersey, but it hits home. Right. Sex trafficking. I think this is the one everyone knows a little bit more about. We've all heard at least something, right? That is defined by the TVPA as commercial sex acts induced by force, fraud, or coercion, or in which the person is induced to perform the act is not of 18 years of age yet. This comes about a lot of ways, but in the US, we mostly see this happening in hotels, motels. We see this happening in illicit massage parlors, online ads. We see online ads really rising. We see resident-based and then other venues. This doesn't mean that this is where the trafficker is initiating contact or targeting their victims, but this is where the actual sex act is happening itself. We'll get a bit more into how traffickers induce their victims in just a second. Here in the US, like I said earlier, we're not really commonly seeing people being nabbed in vans and then sex trafficked. I also want to just put a quick call out to all the media that we see, where we see little white girls being bound and trapped in little basements and on dirty mattresses. Again, not super common. Mostly what we're seeing is traffickers who are building relationships with their victims to earn trust and to emotionally manipulate them, and then using that leverage, that relationship as a leverage to maintain control over their victims. So let's get a bit into the dynamics of human trafficking. Who can be a victim, right? Again, in the media, what we're seeing is a lot of little white girls bound up in duct tape and chains, right? That is not average. Like Ali was saying just a few moments ago when she was introducing the center, there are certain communities, there are certain individuals who are at higher risk of being trafficked than others. And that is just simply because of vulnerabilities, really. That's what it's going to come down to in my conversation with you, is that traffickers target vulnerabilities. And there are certain groups who are living in impoverished communities or are coming from abusive backgrounds or any number of other things that have an increased level of vulnerabilities. So they are higher risk of being trafficked. But that doesn't mean that a trafficker won't traffic you if you're coming from a nice neighborhood. Anyone can be trafficked. It's really about what your vulnerabilities are and can the trafficker easily exploit them. These are some of the populations that we see at increased risk for trafficking. Fleeing war, violence, natural disasters is a really big one. I know that for some people, when Hurricane Sandy happened in the US several years ago, that increased vulnerabilities because people were dislocated. They're rushing to find work, places to live, get things they need. When we're talking about war, we saw that with Ukraine when it was really at its peak with media and people were really paying attention to it. And we're still seeing it as people were fleeing the country and looking for places to go. People were offering safe homes and they're offering places to host families. And then that was leading to people being trafficked and labor trafficking, sex trafficking. It was all over the board. We have persons with substance abuse disorders. If someone is looking for their next fix or their next drink, it makes it very easy for a trafficker to say, I've got this if you're willing to do this for me. Homelessness is, I want to say, one of the biggest ones we see, especially with minor youth trafficking here in the US. Homelessness is not something I'd wish on anyone. And if you're homeless and a trafficker knows that, they're going to offer housing. They're going to offer shelter, whether it be a hotel room or a home or a room in their own home or their couch, something, and then ask or demand that labor or sex act in exchange for offering that shelter. And for people who are like, I wouldn't do that. If I was homeless, I'd just sleep outside. I encourage you to go sleep on a bench for a night in the cold. I guarantee you'll change your mind very quickly. Poverty, I think, is pretty self-explanatory, right? We have poverty. It creates all kinds of gaps and needs in our health and our finances and our personal security. Maybe if there's kids involved, we never know, right? Maybe they need clothes. Poverty, it just creates all kinds of vulnerabilities and holes for traffickers to jump through. We have child abuse survivors and victims. I like to put this on a list because a lot of people don't think about the fact that if you're already being abused as a child, and this was the case for me, I was already being abused as a child when my trafficker met me. And so I had no foundation for healthy relationships and no idea what good boundaries looked like. That trafficker was able to use the fact that I was mentally stunted because I've been abused since I was 4. Yeah, I was mentally stunted. I had no idea what a healthy relationship looked like or what red flags were at all. All my trafficker had to do, and I said this a few trainings back, and it really stuck with me. And it's very true. All a trafficker really has to do is be one step better than the previous abuser, and they've won the whole ball game. My trafficker was horrible to me, but because they were just a smidgen better than my my parents, I trusted them completely and I loved them and I cared about them and I wanted to give them that trust because they treated me so well. Little did I know how awful they were really being. We have domestic violence survivors and victims. DV creates very similar gaps and vulnerabilities that you see in poverty and homeless. They're often left without a home, more often not without the clothes. They're just on their back, maybe not cell phones. They have access to nothing and they need everything very quickly because services usually go from 30 to 90 days. That's really not a lot of time to get your life together and get the resources you need to build a life after you've been abused. So traffickers often target those people because they know that they have an immense amount of vulnerabilities that need to be addressed. LGBTQIAS 2S plus identifying. Again, when we're thinking about youth, there's a 50-50 shot that youth is going to be kicked out of their homes once they come out and they tell their communities that they're identifying in a certain way. They get ostracized in class and in school. There's bullying. Oftentimes their communities that they were already pre-existing part of, think church communities, think sports, any number of other things, they will be isolated from those communities as well. And so traffickers have a lot of vulnerabilities that they can poke holes in to gain trust of those LGBTQI identifying individuals. Persons with disabilities, whether it be in a caretaker role or it be as a friend or a romantic partner, we do see people with disabilities who are being targeted for trafficking, whether that be for their disability income or it be because of cognitive disabilities, and they're able to traffic them by taking their money from work, or they're able to force them into domestic servitude. all number of things, but those play a big role. Then we have guest workers, we have youth in foster care, and we have young people away from home for the first time. I think young people away from the first time, we're talking about more college students here, because again, we're based on a university, but young people who are away from the home for the first time, they're building their relationships, they don't know the area, and traffickers love that, right? Because there's no sense of familiarity, they're really branching out and trying life for the first time, so they're more open to hearing about things, and traffickers take advantage of that. I did want to take a second to give a shout out for male victims of human trafficking. More often than not, you see female victims of myself here in these trainings and these events. And I just want to make a quick shout out that there are almost as many male victims as there are female victims in the world of human trafficking, and they are underreported, and they're largely underreported due to shame and stigma, and because there's less resources available to them. There's housing challenges. There are a lot of reasons why men aren't getting the recognition and the space to speak that they should be getting, but they are just as vulnerable as women and children are to being trafficked. They have the same exact vulnerabilities, but quite honestly, they have less resources than women and children do. So just keeping in mind, don't forget about the men who are being trafficked. So who are the traffickers, right? I guess that's the next question. The traffickers, well, again, much like the victims, can be anyone. I had someone ask me in a training that I did a couple days ago if the majority of traffickers were people who were coming from impoverished areas and were just looking for income, just like the victims. And while sometimes we do see that, I want to break that idea of thought that people have, that most traffickers are all poor people who are just trying to make a buck, right? We have employers, we have crime and gangs, we have parents, we have religious organizations, teachers, coaches. I've heard of diplomats and lawyers and doctors trafficking. There's no one set of person that is or could be a trafficker. Anyone can be a trafficker. Again, it's right here on the list, right? And intimate partners, I'd see, is the one we see the most, followed by family when it comes to sex trafficking here in the US. But all of these people, I've heard a case, or at least one, if not more cases of them potentially have been a trafficker. What really traffickers are looking to do is build trust with their victims, and they're doing it rapidly. They're doing that because they want to gain quick, easy control over their victims. They don't want to be noticed. They don't want to be called out about it. They want the victim to think that they have their best interests at heart and will do whatever they want or need them to do to continue to have those needs met. So it's not so much about where the trafficker came from, it's how they're building those relationships and for what intent. But how do you notice if someone is being trafficked? What are the signs? These are some of the indicators that we see of human trafficking on victims physically, right? A big one is not having access to your documents, whether you are immigrant legally or not, whether you are underage or not. Traffickers take your documents. Mine took my ID, took my social security card, took my birth certificate, and I actually had to figure out how to smuggle my ID back to get out of my trafficking situation when the opportunity arose. And then I had to go through court to get my birth certificate and my social security card back, because they had no way to prove that I was me, because just days before I tried to run away with my new fancy ID, my trafficker had me change my name. So my birth certificate and my social security card didn't even match what was on the ID that I had used to escape. So not having possession of those documents, no way to prove who they are, that's a big one. You're seeing telltale signs of abuse, similar to DV. If you're seeing bruises and consistently seeing bruises, and you're seeing bruises, visible bruises, or in intimate areas, those are big signs. If you're seeing a lot of work-related injuries, if they're always coming back from work hurt and the place of employment is not putting any measures in place to prevent harm from happening to their employees, no safety gear, anything like that, Branding and tattoos are a big one for us in the sex trafficking space. I actually was able to identify a victim out in when I crossed the Call to Wild earlier this year. I was flying to Florida, and I was sitting in the lobby of my terminal waiting on my plane. And I noticed that there's this girl who clearly was not above 18. She was clearly a minor. And she's sitting with three men who are clearly over their 40s or 50s, not even that one. And she's talking about how when they get in, they're going to get into this and how they're going to do this. And, you know, she's clearly talking about activities way above her age group. And so I'm listening in and then thinking about it. And I'm like, okay, that's the first red flag. But then as we're standing behind them and line to board on the plane itself, they're talking about how they need to get her hair done and her nails done. They need to get her some new cute things. So when they arrive, and I was like, okay, that's a big red flag. But what really cinched it for me is when we sat down on the plane, I ended up conveniently one row behind her on the left side. She was on the right, I was on the left. And she put her hand up. And I saw a tattoo right here on her hand. And I was like, oh, and it was a crown. It was a crown with a name written through it. And so I actually sent it to Allie. Allie worked with HSI to contact local authorities to actually be there on site when we landed the plane, and they took them away. But that tattoo was really what cinched it for me, because traffickers like to brand their victims so that the traffickers can say, you're mine, I own you. But also it's a sign to other traffickers, don't mess with my territory. This is mine. You can't have that. So it'll usually look like a crown. It's right here on the hand, or it'll be on the neck, usually somewhere very visible. And it'll have either king or their street name, the trafficker street name, tatted into it. We also see barcodes, and we also see dollar signs being used for this. If there's inappropriate out of place clothing, like with that girl who was wearing what I'm sure she called pants, but was not really pants, and a very inappropriate top. And again, looking young, it really looks out of place. And if you see someone, it's 30 degrees out and they're wearing that type of clothing and they're out and about and inappropriate behaviors, those are things to keep an eye out for. If you think you know the person a little bit better, or someone else might, mental health is a good way to check in on that. As their behavior or mental health changes, has their personality changed? Have they really shut off? Are they afraid? Are they afraid of connecting or talking? Are they afraid of building a relationship with someone? And this could be platonic or not, but are they afraid of, in general, making human connection, or afraid of confiding in people? If they don't want to make eye contact, traffickers are very clear about the fact you not to make eye contact with other people, especially in sex trafficking. That could get you severely beat or even killed. If they're avoiding their support network, if you have a support network already established and you went ghost, that is a really big sign. That was one for me. My trafficker cut me off from everyone, took away my phone, cut off the internet to the house. Actually, funnily enough, that's where the library came in for me when I was being trafficked, was that I used to sneak down to the library in the area when my trafficker wasn't around with a Nook. I don't know if you guys remember those, but I had a Nook, and I would take it down there so that I could connect to the public Wi-Fi at the library so that I could get a hold of people outside of the area to get someone to help me actually get out of my trafficking situation, because she had people all over that town watching me and reporting back to me what I was doing, including that I was going to the library. Socially, if they're never alone, if they're always with that other person, they're not allowed to speak for themselves, or they're only allowed to say certain things on repeat. Those are big ones. If they're constantly being threatened with harm or deportation, or they're afraid of those things happening from one or more individuals, that is a big sign. The stories are inconsistent. If they're saying, oh, I was actually here this weekend, and then later they say they were somewhere else, or they keep changing why that particular person wants something done one way. In general, there's just no consistency. That can be one sign. Environmentally, if they're traveling a lot, again, I want to specify as someone who travels a lot, this isn't necessarily like one sign means trafficking. You're looking for multiple signs. Like I explained when I was telling you about that incident at the airport, you're looking for multiple signs, not just one. But if they're doing frequent travel, or if they live where they work, If they're chauffeured everywhere, or they're not allowed to take any alternative means of transportation besides via that one individual, or if they're working excessively harmful or long hours on repeat, again, with no precautions, no supports being placed by the employer, those are all signs of trafficking. You want to look for multiple, not just one. That doesn't mean that just because it's not trafficking, by the way, that you shouldn't do something about it. Call the appropriate authorities or get them connected to the appropriate resources if they're looking for those. But just as a general all, these are the common ones we see here in the US. These are some of the indicators of child and youth trafficking. There's a lot you'll see here that sort of relates back to what I showed you before, but a couple more that we see really are like the multiple devices. If you see a kid with 2, 3 phones, that's not normal. Traffickers will often give their victims an additional phone or a phone to contact them on, so that there's no cross hairs. So like if you have a parent who does check their children's phone, if I don't know that my kid has a second phone that someone is communicating with her on, I'm not going to be able to catch those messages, that correspondence, and see that red flag in that relationship. If there's excessive traveling for children, that's a big red flag. If they have frequent school absences and they're traveling a lot, big red flag. If they aren't building relationships, kids are naturally social, they're naturally inquisitive, they're naturally very talkative. So if they're not socializing, if they're not engaging with their peers and even with the adults, because even kids who are being abused more often than not will socialize with adults actually over the kids. So they're not socializing. That's a really big sign. I think just if a child has an employer is a pretty big red flag, but if they're also afraid of that employer, that is a massive red flag. Or if they're fearful of anyone in their close network, their family, their parents, no kid should be afraid of the people that are in their intimate circle of life. So if they are, that is a massive red flag. If they have evidence of being controlled, they're only allowed to say certain things on repeat and they're not willing to share more. Their behavior is controlled, how they do things is controlled. If you see those signs of abuse or inappropriate clothing, if they're constantly staying out late, maybe they're with an older friend or partner. We see that a lot in sex trafficking, especially where they have an older boyfriend or girlfriend, and that person comes around, hangs around to school and waits on them to get off, or is messaging them all the time. They're skipping class to be with this person. This person brings them back and forth to school, maybe. Large amounts of cash or new things. Again, traffickers are targeting vulnerabilities. For me, I grew up in a neglectful, abusive family, and I had no access to even clothes, right? I was wearing my father's hand-me-downs. So my trafficker bought me pants. The first time I had pants that were girl pants that fit me in years. My trafficker bought me purses and makeup and jewelry and all these awesome things I never even had access to before in my life. They took me fun places. So if all of a sudden a kid's coming back flush and looking lit, that's a big red flag. Where are they getting that from? Where is that? Who's giving that to them? And what are they giving in exchange for that? Because there's always some give and pull. And then if they're meeting people online, we're seeing that more and more and more in our field as people are meeting each other online. DMing is becoming a thing. Traffickers realize that they can message 30 people at the same time on Instagram versus meeting people one-on-one in real life. Well, the online is way more efficient. So thinking about what relationships are kids building online, what internet safety tools do they have access to, and what does the support system in their life look like if they do encounter something that is fishy online? Are you setting up healthy measures for children so that they can ask if this is normal or not, or gauge how safe a relationship is? Build those tools into your family's lives and encourage that education within families that you engage with, so that not necessarily that they're hyper monitoring children's activity online, but the kids have a place they can go to talk about these relationships and really gauge what the intent is behind the other person on the other side of that screen. We can only protect our kids so much from what's online, but that doesn't mean we can't give them as many tools as possible to use as much discretion as possible. When I was growing up, we didn't have those tools. We didn't really talk about online dangers of the internet, and that ended up being one of my greatest vulnerabilities. These are some of the barriers that victims face when they are being trafficked. I hear it all the time. People ask me all the time, why didn't you just leave? Why don't people just leave? You can just walk out that door. There's nothing stopping you, right? But that's really, truly not true. Blackmail is a big one for traffickers, whether that be the deportation threat, whether that be the threat of harm, whether that be the threat of harm of their families, or calling the cops or reporting them for a crime, because traffickers definitely weaponize the legal system in their favor. Blackmail is a huge one. Financial dependency is another really large one that we see in victims. If you don't have food, if you don't have clothes, if you don't have shelter, if your trafficker is controlling any or all of those things, you have nowhere to go when you try to run away or you try to leave. They have your things, they pay your phone bill, they put food on the table, and there's a roof. Where are you going to go? Not everyone is as lucky as me as to get a hold of someone who pays for me to fly halfway across the country and then lets me stay with them until a bed at Covenant House opens up, right? A lot of people, if they leave their traffickers, they end up back on the streets and just back up in either the trafficker's arms or the arms of another abuser quite often. Isolation is another one. Traffickers want you to be the only person that they depend upon, or sorry, that they want you to only depend on them, is what I'm saying. So if you have family or friends that are also giving you resources, they're going to try and cut off those relationships as quickly as possible, because they don't want you as a victim to actually have more control over your fate. If there's a forced drug use or substance abuse. If there's substance abuse, it's very easy for traffickers to get those ends and maintain control, but also traffickers will force drug use and alcohol on their victims and force that addiction and that abuse disorder on their victims to maintain control. Distrust of authorities. We already see that a lot in a lot of communities, right? We have a lot of communities who are very fearful of authorities right now. There's no communal relationships being built with local law enforcement. So traffickers take that fear and that cloak of mystery around law enforcement and exasperate it to make it so that the victim thoroughly believes that if they go to seek help, that they're going to be arrested or deported or something along those lines. And historically speaking, they're not actually necessarily wrong or even lying. We have had victims who have gone to seek help and have been returned to their traffickers, who have been arrested for crimes, who have been deported. So traffickers already know that tumultuous relationship is there, and they weaponize it to their benefit. There's trauma bonds with the traffickers. Again, that I love you, I care about you, I've treated you the best you've ever had. Traffickers know that, again, if they can weaponize or hold one thing above that victim, that they have complete control. And relationships is a big one. A lot of people, a lot of us are looking for a place to be and someone to love us. And this translates back to traffickers as well. Traffickers know that if I believe that they love me, that I will stay, and they weaponize that. There's also the manipulation and self-blame bit. A lot of victims and survivors believe that we're to blame. We made the choice to go. We made the choice to have a relationship with them. We said yes. So we're obviously to blame. We deserve what's happening to us, because if we had just said no or done something different, we wouldn't be where we are. And this is something that a lot of survivors carry more often than not. Fear of safety or safety of family, mental, physical, sexual, and emotional abuse all play a part. Negative experiences with the system. If I'm in school and I've already gone to my teachers and said that something's wrong and they're not reporting it or they're not caring, or you go to law enforcement and they ignore you, or you go to a healthcare provider and they send you home with your trafficker, all these negative experiences build up and make it less likely for victims to actually come and seek help, which is why relationship building with the community and the people who come into our spaces is so important, because we never actually know when that person is going to need someone that they trust, that they can go and they can talk to. One negative experience can make it so that someone endures trafficking for years longer than they should have ever endured their trafficking, because they had no faith that someone was going to create a space and help them and listen to them when they needed it. And then they don't view themselves as victims. And I already covered this, right? If I'm to blame for what I did, then I'm probably not a victim, right? I'm just feeling sorry for myself and my poor decisions. These are some of the needs that survivors of human trafficking have after being exited from the trafficking, whether that be they exited themselves or someone helped them exit. These are the immediate needs that survivors have, which are going to be food, clothing, shelter, goods, cash assistance, because nobody can get around and get the things that they need if they don't have cash. People are always very against giving cash to people that they pick up and offer services to, but it creates vulnerabilities, because if they need to pay for something like a birth certificate and a social security card, right? If I need to order my birth certificate and it costs $75 for me to do that, and I don't have cash to do that, I can't get a job, I can't get an ID, I can't get a place to live, and I need money. And if I can't get a job because I don't have my documentation, how am I going to get that money? Well, somebody out there is going to offer me that money. Medical is a big one, both mental and physical. We are usually pretty good about the physical part, right, and getting those tests done and those assessments done. But the mental health bit is just as important. If you were trying to process years, months of violent and awful trauma, you're not in the headspace to build a new life. You need someone there walking you through that healing process, helping you to process everything that's happened and helping you actually scope out what's happening next so that you can rebuild your life. Just throwing someone in a shelter and saying, good luck, you have 30 days to figure it out, is not enough. We need that mental health, we need that physical health support, and we need more long-term services. And you'll see that over here in our short, medium, and long-term needs. Often legal services are needed. Long-term housing is needed. Again, that 30 days to 60 days is, I think, the average, right? That's not enough time to get a job, save money, apply for apartments, get approved for something, and get into a place or a room. It's just not. Medical and dental long-term is needed from just years of abuse, substance abuse disorders, being on the streets, the damage that trauma internally causes to us mentally and physically. All those things need to be addressed. I will be receiving medical attention for probably the rest of my life due to my trafficking, mentally and physically. So that's something that, just because I'm not being trafficked anymore doesn't mean I'm not going to need for forever, but it is not something that is often thought about. Job training, education, childcare, peer support, and maybe mentors, maybe having those long-term group offerings available. All those are things that survivors need post-trafficking. And now I'm actually going to turn it back over to Allie, and Allie's going to go over the intersections of libraries and human trafficking.
Hey, here we go. Let me come back. Thank you, Christabel. I'm just going to pause for a moment to see if anybody has any questions for Christabel before I get started. Any burning? I didn't see anything in the chat, so just want to see if anybody has anything. Just if you have a question, I guess we can't see you, so just put it in your chat.
Yes, definitely put in the chat or the Q&A, or we can answer your questions after Allie's next part if that's easier for you.
Okay, great. So Christabel highlighted in her presentation kind of how she went to the library for internet access and to kind of a safe space away from her trafficker. So in this section, we're going to really cover what is known, which is very anecdotal. There's been absolutely no research done. There's been no papers written. There's really been very little about the intersection of libraries and human trafficking. When I did a lit review search to see what was written, there nothing came up. So, this is kind of new territory, and I applaud all of you for being part of this training to, learn more about it. Next slide, please. So other reasons that survivors might seek to go in a library And we're talking about libraries kind of broadly. We're talking about public libraries here, but it could also be an academic library. It could be like a medical school or a university library. So we're really just talking about all types of libraries, but libraries are a place that traffickers don't really think that their survivor is going to go to. So it's kind of an undercover place where they can go to get away, to get out of the elements, maybe to meet someone that it might be dangerous if their trafficker saw them meet that person. It's a place where they can get some resources and education, maybe attend a workshop, or I know Christabel's a very avid reader, somewhere where you can get books for free, since you probably don't have a lot of pocket money if you're a trafficker. It also is a place where you can use the restroom. I know some traffickers have used the library as a place to kind of catch up on some sleep if the library allows that. So some signs for all of you that someone might be a survivor, victim of human trafficking, is if you see someone kind of coming in alone, and they're coming in frequently. And like Christabel said, they might have clothing on that isn't really gender or size appropriate. They might not be dressed for the appropriate elements. I've worked on several cases where people were trafficked from Florida or California, but they were in New York, New Jersey area, and they only had summer clothing. And it's the middle of winter and they're wearing flip-flops. So, something like that might be a red flag. If they try to really stay under the radar, maybe not making eye contact, trying to just kind of sneak away and hide somewhere, that could be a sign. If they're trying to avoid conversation because they don't want to draw attention to themselves. And again, Christabel went over some of these behaviors where they might act very timid or afraid. Even if you came over and asked if you could help them or if they needed anything, they might act like extremely paranoid or nervous or anxious. Next slide, please. So we're going to talk about a case study of, I believe it was now 2 summers ago, where a library employee in New Jersey actually identified a case of human trafficking. We had been developing a relationship with this library. This is a library that does employ a full-time social worker. And we were in discussions with this library because we were talking about, maybe there is a need to do some training on the issue of human trafficking in libraries. And they were interested because of having a couple of social workers. They thought it might be a good idea. So we were kind of building our relationship and talking about what kinds of trainings we might do and who we might reach out to, when I got a call from one of the social workers saying they think they identified a case. So the way this case came to light was that the social worker had developed a relationship with a client who was homeless and was living in a shelter. So that client was coming in regularly, for some of the reasons I mentioned on the previous slide, right? Like to use the internet, to have somewhere to go, to get out of the elements. And they developed a relationship, a trusting relationship, which is really important because Christabel talked about how survivors of trafficking are not just raising their hand saying, I'm a victim of human trafficking, right? They're very fearful of what will happen if they leave their trafficker. They don't trust people because they've often experienced abuse either in their families and at the hands of the traffickers. So, having someone that they can trust is huge and can't really be overestimated. So one day this client actually brings someone with her, which appeared to the social worker to probably be a minor, though it turns out it wasn't. She was 18, but it looked like she was a minor just based on her appearance. The young woman that she brought with her was, ungroomed, not dressed properly, was very anxious, nervous, a lot of the signs that Christabel talked about in her presentation. So because of the trust that library had developed with that first client, she felt comfortable enough to bring this young woman here to the library and to introduce her to the social worker. And she actually disclosed that she was being forced to exchange sex for a hotel room and for food and for drugs. And I just want to mention drugs a little bit, that oftentimes survivors of trafficking are don't use drugs until their traffickers introduce them and force them to use drugs. Traffickers can force their victims to be mules and to carry drugs so that they don't risk, any kind of law enforcement issue. And they often can force their victims to use drugs as a way to control them. Because if someone gets addicted to drugs, then they will make getting, their next fix of drugs a top priority, and they're easier to control by the traffickers. So she disclosed this, and, luckily, because we have that relationship with this social worker, he called me and we discussed kind of what to do, what the next step should be, whether or not to call law enforcement, etc. And that's this case really was the impetus for us to get this training going, because if it's happening in one library, it's probably happening in other libraries. Christabel, did you want to add something in? I see something in the chat here.
I just wanted to point out really quickly, and I was trying to do it in the chat. Sorry, Allie. Just that.
No problem. You're always welcome to chime in.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Most victims and survivors, they don't know the language, quote, human trafficking. They're not going to just stroll into a library or do anywhere and say, I'm being trafficked. Most people use language like I'm being controlled, I'm being tricked, I'm being pent, like any other form of language that translates to someone is controlling me or my actions or forcing me to do something that I don't think is quite right. But most victims do not know the terminology human trafficking. And even if they've heard it before in a casual setting, they don't actually understand what human trafficking means or how to use that language. So just keeping in mind that they're not going to understand human trafficking. So when you may be identifying this as human trafficking, they're using language like I'm being controlled, I'm being forced, I'm being tricked out. They're not, so that like just being aware of that communication barrier and those two different mindsets, I think is really important in the identification process.
Great. Thank you, Christabel. I somehow just got off our, I lost okay, there we go. Next slide, please. So here's an opportunity for you all to get involved in our training. So based on what I just explained to you, the case study, what factors do you think led to the identification of this victim? Feel free to just put it in the chat if you have any ideas. What do you think what was special about this library, or what steps did this social worker library do that led to them being, okay, good, their appearance, right? That they definitely knew there was something off in the way they were dressed and how they appeared so disheveled. So like really being observant. So the fact that the social worker was observant, excellent. Anything else? What other factors? Yeah, that creating a safe space for sharing. That's why I really underscored that trust that, you don't have to be a social work to create a safe space for sharing, right? Just being kind to someone who looks like they need kindness is the first step in kind of developing that trusting relationship, particularly because victims don't often have a lot of people that are being kind to them in their life. So, saying hello, trying to make eye contact, being kind is actually very important. And the fact that social worker, saw the first client multiple times kind of created that trusting relationship. Right. That she'd been brought in by somebody who knew her in the situation and trusted the library staff. Excellent. What about the fact that the library even had a social worker? How many of you have social workers in your libraries? Because I know not all libraries do have social workers. And so I think a big factor is that there was a trained person that is exclusively, focusing on assisting patrons that come into the libraries. Right, social work interns, that's great. But while it's great to have a social worker or social worker intern, this is definitely something that, you know, regular staff could just be on the outlook for as well. Great. So we see Atlantic City as a social worker on staff. Excellent. So now I'm asking the question, you know, how would your library have responded, right? If we didn't know each other and this social worker called me, what do you think your library would have done if somebody disclosed that they were being forced to sleep in a hotel and exchange sex for food, money, etc.? Is there a protocol in place at your libraries? Just put in the chat if you have a protocol, if you've been trained on trafficking, or if you want to share anything about how your library would respond. And then the next question is, should law enforcement be called? So that was one of the, you know, key questions of the social worker was, should I call law enforcement? And we'll talk a little bit about that in the next slide. I think we have a slide on that. So someone's saying my director would most likely call the police, and none of us has been trained. Right. So one of the issues with calling the police, and we'll talk about that more in another slide, is that police often are not trained on this either. And you could be doing more harm than good if you don't know when to call the police or which police to call. So we're going to talk about that. Are there any other challenges that this presents to your library if someone came in and disclosed this? Right, so people are chatting, they're not sure if they have a protocol or a policy. And if you could think of any resources that your library might need to either prevent human trafficking or to respond to human trafficking. Great. Next slide, please. Great. So what this library actually did was they followed their standard questioning. They did what they were trained to do as social workers if somebody comes in with a serious issue. They were able to share resources. They referred this person to a human trafficking program and a human trafficking shelter that we gave them. The social worker was able to give the survivor their business card in case they had any other issue. They did not notify law enforcement because the survivor did not want them to. So this is really important because if your library starts calling the police on its patrons, word will get out that that library is not a safe place, right? That library can't be trusted. And because most often the police don't really understand trafficking. And so unless we call a specific officer or members of a specific law enforcement task force, you're not getting someone who is properly trained to identify someone in human trafficking. So we're happy to report that this survivor was able, the last we heard, to be enrolled into a drug rehab program and was working with a service provider to get out of the situation. So that is a positive outcome from that library kind of intervening. Next slide. So what can libraries do to prevent human trafficking? Next slide. So preventing human trafficking basically means giving information, raising awareness, letting people know about this crime. So things that I think libraries can do fairly easily and inexpensively, because we know library staff often is overstretched and has a lot on their plate. So they can provide a fact sheet on human trafficking, kind of have copies of it out on a resource table or on a bulletin board, or even taped up in the bathroom. They can post information. There is a national human trafficking hotline, and you could post a poster. There's downloadable posters on the website that you can print out with a color printer and just post those in prominent places around your library. You can invite local anti-trafficking organizations or someone like us at the Global Center on Human Trafficking, and we can come in and we can hold a workshop for your staff or for your community. There's a lot of really good books written on human trafficking, some written by survivors. So you can organize a book group or organize a display of books about the issue of human trafficking. And we have a list we can give you to guide you, because there are some bad books out there that are kind of sensational. And so we can provide you with some reputable books to read. Next slide, please.
Allison, if I can jump in real quick, we do have two
Sure.
comments in the chat. Jennifer Bozeman said, on your earlier point, either use contact or another center off our person in charge response list.
Okay,
Again,
great. What is contact? I don't know what contact is.
contact is just like local resources, like human services.
Great. Great. Yeah, that's a great idea. And that's why we will put in the chat our directory that we compiled of organizations that address human trafficking, in case you don't have in your contact list someone that specializes in trafficking. You can look in our directory and see who's the closest provider to you.
And information, Jennifer's commenting, more information on contact is posted in the restrooms of the library.
Okay, great. Excellent. So we need to make
and-
sure that those centers are trained, right? Trained with human trafficking, trained on
Yeah.
the issue. Excellent.
I do have one more question from Rosa. How do we deal with minors who are not interested in help due to not wanting to go to foster care?
Right. And I believe libraries are not mandated reporters. Is that correct?
I believe so.
Believe they are not, or they are?
They are not, I believe.
They are not. I wonder if social workers are. I don't know if there's any library social workers on this call that could comment on whether, if you're a social worker in a library, if you're a mandated reporter. So this would be one of the instances where I would suggest that you actually do call the police. Because if it is a minor, and if you know that they're a minor, I mean, sometimes it's hard to tell, right? Like in that case study, the social worker thought that the person was a minor, but it turned out they were 18. This is a whole new area that we're just learning about. So that's something we really need to figure out is if social workers in libraries are mandated reporters, or I don't believe libraries are. But I usually recommend, if it's a minor, to call the police, because it's a minor, and minors are given special protection under both international and US law. So there's something called the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And it's a UN convention, and that outlines the rights and responsibilities of minors. And basically it means that minors can't really have the agency to make decisions about things like whether or not to call law enforcement until they're 18 years of age or older, or in some places 21. So I would say that that's a time that you would actually call the police. I don't know if Christabel, you want to add anything to that question?
No, thank you, Allie. I just want to add in, like I said earlier, that I knew to just a systematic way that communities typically approach law enforcement, that if for some reason that there are concerns about calling law enforcement in these situations, such as this person is African American, there may already be a fear or trauma of law enforcement there, and I want to be more mindful about how I'm approaching this, or I'm worried about external risks or causing harm. You can work with minors. I was one of those minors who refused to call law enforcement because I was really afraid of being sent back to my parents, and the entire reason I had gone with my trafficker was to get away from my parents. And so what I saw people doing, that I'm thinking back on it now that I have a different perspective, is that they were relationship building a little bit with me. They were just getting to know who I was, where I was coming from. They weren't forcing the help on me, but more getting to know me. And as they got to know me and understand me, they were offering tidbits of advice and support and saying like, hey, like, if you're struggling with finding clothes or food or these things, I actually know this resource. You can go if you want on your own, like that's totally an option, or like I can help you get this information and let them know that you're coming, like it's whatever. But they gave me lots of options. They gave me a sense of control over the situation, and they were building relationships and trust with me. Just because traffickers are building relationships and trust doesn't mean that people with good intentions can't also do the same thing and help people. So if it's not law enforcement, don't be afraid of building some relationship there and establishing a level of trust and giving that potential victim as much control over choices as possible actually usually leads to much more positive outcomes than not.
Excellent. Thank you. Great. And thank you for, let's see who put that in the chat, Lynn, about that anyone can call the hotline, the child abuse hotline. So thanks for sharing that resource. That's terrific. Next slide, please. Okay, so now we're going to return to responding, right? So prevention is one thing, right? What you can do to just refer for resources, et cetera. Responding is a little bit more active and proactive. And, you know, that's something that the library needs to decide if they want to be in a position to respond, if they want, you know, this takes some commitment, right? Because the first thing is you got to get your staff trained. You can't respond to something unless everybody has knowledge, a certain baseline knowledge and education about the issue. So thank you all for coming today. So that's the first step. And then the next step really would be to develop some sort of policy or protocol for your library on the issue of human trafficking and how to respond, who would respond, and who do you call in different types of scenarios. And that's also something that we could help you put together. And then in order to have a policy or protocol, you need to develop some partnerships in your community where you can refer the individuals, because your staff, even if you have a social worker on staff, will not be equipped for the intense needs of survivors. You know, Christabel mentioned a lot of them in her training. You know, it could be legal needs, it could be housing, could be needs to get documents. I mean, this is way more intensive than what any library staff member could really take on. So it's really important to have those partnerships in place. So when you identify someone, you have, you know, a system of ready to refer them. You'll probably also want to put together some resources, whether you want to use ours, our resource manual, or another one. You probably want to have something that you can hand out to people if you suspect there might be a trafficking situation going on. We have one that we have for the university. If someone suspects there might be a student or faculty member at Montclair that's trafficked, we have like a one-pager handout that we can give to them. So you might want to create something like that. Also, a lot of communities have anti-trafficking task forces. And if those exist, you might want to be in contact with them, because they have a lot of law enforcement that are very dedicated and highly trained on the issue of human trafficking. And the best thing is to have, you know, the actual phone number of a cop or state police or FBI or whoever it may be in your community that really knows and cares about this issue. That way you have someone to call that you know, and you know they know how to handle this properly. Building relationships with other anti-trafficking NGOs, that's very similar to develop partnerships or referrals. And then one thing in terms of if there's immediate danger, you know, I could imagine a situation where there is somebody like Christabel went into the library and maybe her trafficker figured out that she went in there and he came in. So if you ever feel like you're in the presence of a dangerous person or that the trafficker is there, you know, you definitely can call 911. You should not try to intervene yourself. That could be very dangerous for you, could be very dangerous for the victim, survivor. And so we highly recommend you do not take the matter into your own hands. And if a victim is a minor, I guess we will update this slide to also include that information that Lynn gave us. You can call and do a mandatory, you could call and report to the Child Abuse and Neglect Hotline, or you could call a trusted law enforcement person. Next slide. I did notice too that Christabel put our resource into the chat. So if you want to copy that link, and you can check out that directory, and feel free. It's got a lot of pages. I don't know if you want to print. I think it's like 80 pages, but it's there for your use. So a few don'ts. You do not want to become their case manager, like I mentioned. It could be very dangerous for you. It could be very dangerous for them. You really want to get them into the hands of a professional who is trained on providing services to victims of human trafficking. It's a very specific population, and you could do more harm than good, even if you have good intentions. If it's an adult, you definitely do not want to call law enforcement without their consent. Again, getting law enforcement called could be life-threatening for the victim. It could be very dangerous. If they want you to call law enforcement, that's another thing. Then, go ahead. But we really like to be sure that it is the victim or the survivor that is making the decision on what is in their best interest. Next slide, please. So just a couple of more tips on what you can do. I know we only have a few minutes left, but somebody mentioned this in the chat, trying to be non-judgmental, supportive, kind, asking someone what they need, listening, making sure you have consent, making sure that the victim and survivor has agency and that we don't just tell them what to do. And always just being upfront, never promising something that you can't deliver, right? Just being really transparent about what you can and cannot do. And like Christabel mentioned earlier, providing different ways that they could follow up, right? So maybe it's giving them a flyer, maybe it's giving them the hotline number, maybe it's giving them some referrals, are all things that you can do. Next slide, please. So this is the human trafficking hotline. If you Google this online, you'll find all kinds of templates, posters. They have different things you can download. And you can, hang this up. It's not like a perfect solution. We have called and had to wait significant amount of times before, but it really is all we have in the United States right now. And they do have connections to service providers and law enforcement across the United States. Next slide. So, and we are here to help. So we are, we have this library initiative. We are also starting a study to better understand human trafficking and the connection with libraries. So we're actually forming an advisory council. We're doing a pilot across the state of New Jersey to put together a short and simple survey to understand how libraries know about human trafficking. Have they been trained? Have they identified anyone? What are they interested in? Are they interested in getting information? Are they interested in learning more, etc.? So if this topic interests you and you want to stay involved, please put your name and email address in the chat, and we will be happy to send you the information about this advisory group that we're putting together. It will be like a once a month commitment, and the role of the advisory group will be to help us develop the survey from the library perspective, help us form the questions, help us get other libraries to fill out the survey, and once we do the analysis, help us interpret the results. So we would really welcome your participation. And if you know of others at your library, we welcome all kinds of staff, whether you're a librarian, whether you're a desk person, whether you're an educator, a janitor, everyone, whatever your role is in the library, we would really welcome your perspective, because as we mentioned in the beginning, this is really groundbreaking work. We are the first ones doing this. So we only have a few minutes, but if there are any questions that didn't get answered, we'd be happy to use our last few minutes to answer them. John, did we miss any questions in the chat?
I didn't see any. There's a few other resources that are being shared. Lynn shared
Fantastic.
the URL and some more information about the 24/7 call center.
Excellent. Fantastic. Great. We'll give it a few more minutes, see if anybody has any questions. Okay, well, thank you all so much for being a great audience and sharing your expertise and your resources. And thank you, John, for all the help of New Jersey Link in getting this training organized and out there. And thank you, Christabel, as always, for sharing your experience. And I think everyone can probably tell today how important it is to really learn firsthand from people who have experienced this crime. And I see a few names of people that are interested. So thank you so much. We will probably early next week, be sending out the information with the date and time of the call. The first call will be in January, and a little bit more about our study. So we will be sure to get you all of that information. Great. Thank you so much, everyone. We get everybody? I took a picture, Christabel, to get some of those texts down.
I messaged them all to you on Slack, so you should.
Okay, excellent. Great.
All right,
Yeah, I've got them copied just in case we lost it, but
you're the best. Thank you.
Great.
thanks for the
John,
presentation.
when does your next newsletter go out? Do you have one going out anytime soon?
We just sent one out for this week, I think next Thursday or Friday.
Okay.
If I sent you over your the materials, would you think you'd be able to put it in your newsletter to see if anybody else is interested in joining our advisory
Please
group?
do. Yeah.
Okay, that would be fantastic. Thank you.
Yeah, if you send it to either me or Darby, we'll make sure it gets in there.
Okay, excellent.
Yeah.
Great. Well, so nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too. Thank you so much for the presentation.